Và là Dũng xin kính chào quý vị khán thính giả. Buổi interview hôm nay sẽ là interview với sử gia Veith về quyển sách của ông là quyển Tuốt Kiếm Phương xa, tiếng Anh tức là Drawn Swords in the Distant Land. Jay, welcome. It's nice to have you today.
Thank you for being here.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. How old were you when the war started?
Well, I was 18 when the war ended in 75, so I guess I would have been 5, depending upon when you count the war started. But so I was 18 in 1975.
Any concepts about Vietnam War at the time, or you just like?
No, I don't remember anything about it. It wasn't something that I was aware of. I'm sure that I saw things on the news, but I don't have any memories of it as a child.
Not as a child, but when you study U.S. history, how does the Vietnam War come to you at the time?
I think I was always very interested in military history, but more American military history, World War I, World War II. I was aware of the Vietnam War and was certainly interested in it, but it wasn't, at first, something that I was fascinated by. It wasn't until much later that I became very fascinated by the events of the war.
What about when you were in college?
Same thing. I was studying more World War II because I was going to become an officer in the American Army and a tank officer, so we studied the battles of World War II and things of that nature, but not Vietnam.
When you were saying that you're going to the college for military, is there a lot of history in there, or is it just more of a...
It was more, there wasn't a great focus on military history per se. I myself was always very interested in military history. It was something that fascinated me from a very young age. Not only military history, but history itself. You know, what happened with, and especially historical mysteries. So it was something that I was always drawn to.
Any say legacy from the Vietnam War, any talk from your elder, your senior when you were in college and you were in the Army?
Yes, so I had Vietnam veterans who were mentors. Many of my sergeants were Vietnam veterans who had served. They often talked about the war and what they had done. And so I think that's how I sort of became interested or spend more time learning about it because of them and understanding their service and what they had gone through.
What's the narrative? What's the typical?
I think for them, as they were mostly infantry guys who had served either in special forces or in just line units, they thought that the story of the war had not been told correctly. That there was a lot of things that happened that people didn't understand. And it was tough for them to translate their personal experiences into a broader narrative of the war.
How do they view the journalists at the time?
I don't remember them specifically talking about journalists, but I think from their perspective, this whole idea that the war had not been told, that what had happened in the war had not been told correctly, probably had something to do with the journalists and the media.
Would you say that as a historian, your background in your military studying or anything like that will kind of shape your view about the Vietnam War, or would it come later?
So that's a great question. So I think that my background as a military officer and my fascination with military history is what drew me to it, because it seemed to me that the ability to talk about the South Vietnamese military was the great unknown of the war. You know, we had Americans focused on what the Americans were doing, and then American historians focused on what the Americans were doing and what the North Vietnamese were doing, but no one had focused on what the South Vietnamese were doing. And that's, I think, what drew me into this, was wanting to tell the story of the South Vietnamese and get it right.
And what's the motive? What inspired you into this? So why the Vietnamese?
Well, I think I saw that there was this, I don't want to say great injustice, but that the story had not been told well and had been told wrongly in many ways. And so it was way too much on the negative side. And as I began to meet South Vietnamese officers and they would tell me what they had done during the war, it became very apparent very quickly that there was this tremendous story that had never been told. And I thought, well, this is my chance to tell their stories, and I need to sort of tell their stories before it's too late.
Mm-hmm. How does it compare and contrast with the story that you've heard before when you were in the Army and the other senior officer of yours was telling you before, and with the one that you talked with the Vietnamese?
Well, it's hard for me to answer because it's so long ago, I don't remember them. They were mostly focused on, the stories that they told me were mostly focused on their own American units and what they had done. They didn't have a lot of, I don't remember a lot of stories about the South Vietnamese per se.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any specific person that really influenced you into this direction, telling you where to go, kind of?
Well, the first man I think that sort of pushed me in this direction was a Colonel Ed Metzner, who I had met at the Texas Tech Conference, and he was the one who told me these incredible stories about, at that time, Colonel Lê Minh Đào, and who eventually became General Lê Minh Đào and commanded the 18th Division. And he always told me what a great officer he was, how hardworking he was, how that he could get so many things done. And so Ed took General Dow as an example to say, it's not just General Dow, it was many other Vietnamese who did similar things whose stories have never been told and will be lost to history. And so that's what pushed me in the direction of talking to General Dow and learning his story.
Okay, so you're starting with General Dow.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of believe from there you branch out.
Correct.
I think reading your book, the way of you doing research is very different from other academics. People coming from academia are always kind of looking into the previous book, looking into the previous source, looking at outside. They read the French history, they read the Russian or whatever, but all in the academia. But yours is completely different. It's more pragmatic in a way that you look at the communication from the foreign service. You look at the telegram from
mm-hmm.
back and forth from Washington and the CIA. I noticed that's a lot of information, a lot of documents are coming from there. How do you get these access, and why are you researching that direction?
That's a great question. So in academic research, one is supposed to look at what previous scholars have done. That is what is known as, you have to look at what they've done to see what they've said or not said, and then synthesize what they do. But because so many Americans had not written about the South Vietnamese or written about them very negatively or only put a very small amount in, I had to start from scratch. We say start from scratch, So my goal was to look at not only what try not to just use what the Americans were saying about the South Vietnamese, but to actually go look at the South Vietnamese memoirs and things that they've written to get the South Vietnamese voice about themselves. And fortunately, I was able to also interview many of the people who were senior officers or senior government officials at the time to get their inside stories. So that's what I think is the strength of the book, is it's not just using American sources to understand the South Vietnamese, but to use South Vietnamese sources and American sources to understand and to come to a conclusion.
Yeah, it seems to me like if you're doing research from different directions like that, you would be likely to have a lot of conflicts. And how do you really, by what criteria do you so-called draw out the facts?
Right.
You have conflicting tales from both sides, and then.
Well, that's a great question too, because what happens is that you have different perspectives, And I remember General Cao Van Vien always told me, that the Vietnam War is very much like the seven samurai. I can't remember the name of the movie, but there's always different perspectives. So what I tried to do is, if there was a document that said this happened and this happened and this happened, I tried to find a collaborating document to back that up. Because if you had somebody who said, "Oh, this happened," but 5 other people said, "No, it didn't happen this way," then you have to go with the 5 people.
What about the chances that those 5 people are wrong and then that one person is...
Well, that's the judgment you have to make as the author to try to figure out what is the facts, you know. And sometimes you can't make a conclusion. And sometimes you only have to say, well, person X said this and person Y said this, and here's what I think happened, and let the reader judge from there what they think is right.
You are coming from the military, but there's also other people coming from the journalist side. Let's talk about Neil Sheehan, Peter Arnett, or David Halberstam, and people like that, Francis Fitzgerald.
I think that those people they were in Vietnam, but they didn't speak the language. They had a difficulty understanding the culture, and they had a very deep bias. People forget the time, you know. It was the 60s. There was a revolutionary fever growing around the world, and so they made it seem like the South Vietnamese were this corrupt right-wing government fighting a revolution of the people, and it was never, you know, and so they were biased against South Vietnam.
You would say that with David Halberstam and Francis Fitzgerald, these are the journalists that came into there and they did that study deeper than a lot of other. If you come back to, like, say, 1972, I don't know about other people, but for me, popular history is something that I always read. And these are 2 books that I remember. One is Francis Fitzgerald, Fire in the Lake, which I think won the Pulitzer Prize in 1972. The other one is The Best and Brightest, David Halberstam. Whatever I read, it seems like forever that people keep drawing from all these books because that seems all they have through the ages.
So the Francis Fitzgerald book, Fire in the Lake, did win the Pulitzer. But if you read it carefully, it's exactly how I just described. The South Vietnamese are this corrupt, right-wing government that's never going to win the war. They don't have any popular support. The people don't like them. They are only in government because the Americans are propping them up with money and weapons, whereas the communists are, you know, the saviors of the country, and all the people love them, and all this other stuff. I mean, and they're going to win eventually, and that was very much the flavor of the time, because there was, you know. But I think people now who would read her book or look at her book would just shake their head, and because you can see the bias in her writing. Same thing with Halberstam.
But still, I mean, it's a very forceful telling. When I came to the United States in, I would say, 1980, we were so poor, and we went to a lot of Goodwills to pick out the books. I remember almost all the Goodwill store that I went to, there was David Halberstam and Fire in the Lake, that's why. And those happened to be the first 2 that I struggled. My English at the time was nowhere near it is right now. So reading David Halberstam and Francis Fitzgerald was like nightmare.
Right.
I tried to.
Right.
Try to understand, but after I understand that's the only narrative I had coming from kids. So what am I supposed to say? You know, if all the Americans and all these officers were convinced by these tales, kids like me, that's all we have. That's why we never said anything.
But I think you have to remember, though, that those books were written and published 30, 40 years ago now. And so to our earlier point, the scholarship on the war, so those are considered popular histories, not academic histories.
Correct.
Right? So the scholarship on the war has moved well beyond those 2 books. So maybe they are still famous in popular, as you mentioned, histories, but they are not considered good histories in the academic world. There's a distinction and difference between the 2.
But if you go on, and I think another Pulitzer Prize from Neil Sheehan, The Bright Shining Light, of course it still is a popular history I'm talking about. And then a very recent one, Embers of War. They also continue from the tale, and to me these are like repeating the same thing of the first 2, where it's drawing, especially Embers of War, for example. It extended on the both the David Halberstam and Francis, but it's still coming from those two sources, and it's Pulitzer again. So how do you explain that?
I can't. I mean, the Embers of War won the Pulitzer. Again, it was mostly focused on the communist side, not the South Vietnamese side. So, you know, there's it's hard for me to explain. I can't.
I don't know how they judge it, but I would say that the Pulitzer Prize most of the time reflect the view of the journalists, as far as I could see. And for 40 years at least, it hasn't changed from 1972 until 2012. That's 40 years right there. That's only 10 years from now. And you said that it had proceeded a lot.
Yeah, but again, even though Lodgevol's book is an academic book, the scholarship on South Vietnam in particular has dramatically changed in the last 10, 15 years. So that you see more and more books and articles written and judging the Republic of Vietnam much more favorably, being able to see them as trying to control their own destiny, trying to shape their country, trying to build their country in the midst of a war. And that's what Drawn Swords is about. How South Vietnam was trying to build their country in the midst of a war, and how very, very difficult that is.
That's on the Vietnam side. Let's talk a little bit about the intervention from the American side. The question of legitimacy. If you look at American coming in, it seems to me like the South Vietnam, it is not my narrative, but people saying that it's a bastard of the American and the Geneva Conference. It's just like Vietnamese on the South side is a product of both the American and the Geneva Conference. It's like they don't have a country, they just prop up the South. You know, it wasn't there before, the president wasn't there, he wasn't actually represent the people. They just prop up the South.
So you're saying it like it was an artificial state.
Exactly.
Well, there's always, if you look at Vietnamese history, there was two strains of political thought. The first goal was to get rid of the French, overthrow the French, form their own country. There was one side that wanted the country to be a communist state. There was another side that had different versions of nationalism, being a Republican, and different versions of how democracy and republicanism works, you know? And you had the Die Viets, you have the VNQDD, you had other people who had different thoughts about how. So that both the French and the Americans recognized that there was these two distinct bodies of political thought. And so the French and the Americans wanted to create and support a non-communist Republican South Vietnam. And eventually it became South Vietnam because the communists were much stronger in the north than they were in the south. So when the Geneva Convention happened, they're saying, okay, we're going to have a South Vietnam where the nationalists can go and the North Vietnam where the communists can go, and then we're going to, the West will support South Vietnam. I hope that answers your question.
I think the Geneva Conference was saying like they have like 2 years after, and then they have the general election for the whole country. Right. Yes, people were allowed to go to the South and North and they set up, but it was never intended to be a different country. It was a
temporary boundary, yes.
Yes, and then I think the creation of the Republic of Vietnam, because the Americans refused to sign and the Vietnamese refused to sign. And
the Americans had nothing to do with the Geneva Convention. It was the French, and but the South Vietnamese government refused to sign the Geneva Accords, and so they were not legally bound to hold the elections. A fact that people forget, you know.
Very true. But does that really make them a country, you think, or just?
Well, that's a broader political question. What makes a country? Is it culture? Is it shared values? Is it a vision of how we're going to organize ourselves as a society? And I think that the bulk of the people who wanted to be in South Vietnam did not want to be under a communist regime. But there was other people who didn't understand the differences between the two. So it was, so the South Vietnamese government was trying for years to try and convince the whole country, everybody in the country, that this was the best political system to build the country, to change society for the better, to help the very poor people in the villages, to bring in education and healthcare and build roads and stuff, and so, rather than being a communist country,
so
communist system.
So you see two competing versions. Let's see, two competing visions for the Vietnamese.
Yes.
One is the nationalistic, the other one is communistic.
Correct.
And the communists always insist there's only one vision, I mean, unification of the country.
Well, they had a vision for a unified Vietnam, and they were going to impose it on everybody whether they wanted it or not. And that's the big difference, is that communism is, in essence, especially the Vietnamese communism, is designed that we're going to take over the country, and whether you want this or not, we are going to do it. Whereas the nationalist version had room for many different visions, you know, and not trying to put a gun to somebody's head and say, you're going to do it my way or else. So that's, you know, ultimately the difference.
The American intervention, when they come in, what kind of vision do they have at that point? And do you think the policy that they coming in, the way that they intervene, let's take 1965, for example, I mean, coming straight from Bùi Diệm book, In the Jaw of History. The Vietnamese, the Southern government wasn't informed at all until the last minute.
Well, we have to differentiate between two things. So Bùi Diệm book talks about the American Marines landing in Da Nang and not being told by the Americans until the last minute, and them not wanting American military forces on the ground because it would feed the communist propaganda that the South Vietnamese government was nothing but puppets of the Americans. They thought that having American combat troops would undermine their legitimacy. But the Quat government falls, Nguyen Cao Ky, Nguyen Van Thieu take over in June of '65. The military situation was turning very bad. There was some very significant defeats of South Vietnamese forces. And so in July of '65, Thieu and Ky, and people also forget this, they're the ones that asked for American combat troops. They wanted them to come in to help support the government militarily, but only in certain sections of the country. They didn't want American troops near the villages. They didn't want American troops mingling with the people. They wanted them to go to the borders to prevent the North Vietnamese from coming across the borders. But so there was both the American military officers and the South Vietnamese senior military officers decided that this was the best thing. But as in all things, as the war got worse and worse and worse and more American troops were needed, that distinction eventually was washed away.
Yeah, but when you say the intervention, would it be better if they can combine the political side with the military side? Because you were saying that Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Cao Ky was asking for, and they were military men, and Dr. Phan Huy Quat is the prime minister, like it or not. Is it a kind of hasty?
Well, no, because Quat was gone by that time. So that we're talking, so Quat did not want, Quat, the civilian prime minister, did not want American combat troops because of the political viewpoint. But he was gone by mid-June of '65. Then Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Thieu came in. They became the chief of state and the prime minister, respectively. And by July of '65, then they held, when this military situation was not looking very good, they held a meeting with the senior Americans, Westmoreland and McNamara, and they asked for American combat troops. And in fact, Nguyen Cao Ky wanted to ask the Koreans for a combat division as well. But they only wanted them to go to the borders, not to mingle with the population. Because Thieu himself saw that it was still the responsibility of the Vietnamese military to do most of the fighting. They just wanted the Americans as a shield against the North Vietnamese main force.
Well, as you say, so I can understand why there are a lot of Americans coming in during the Johnson administration. You were talking about 100, 200, or even more, 1,000. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people coming in if the initial intention was only staying outside and protecting the side. Well, why is that?
Because the sad part of the war is that the more Americans came in to help defend the country and fight, the more North Vietnamese were sending their troops down. So as the enemy force grew, we had to have more Americans come in to help fight. So they made a decision, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have the American troops fight the North Vietnamese. And we're going to have the South Vietnamese army fight the guerrillas in the villages. All right, we're going to have a division of responsibility. The ARVN will go to the villages and guard there so we can begin pacification. The Americans will fight the North Vietnamese. That was the idea.
But the idea, could it have been opposite? The Vietnamese fighting and then the American do the pacification? What do you think about that?
Well, no, because the idea was that South Vietnamese troops would be in the villages. They speak the language, they're Vietnamese, they know the culture, whereas Americans don't speak Vietnamese, don't know the culture. And so the decision was made, and I think a right one, to let the South Vietnamese army guard the villages. They were bringing in the R&D cadre to begin the pacification. So the ARVN would create a shield, a military shield, allow the cadre to do the pacification, where the Americans then would go fight the more heavily armed North Vietnamese.
So the story seems to me like you said the intervention was correct, all the option was correct at the time. It was pragmatic from the side of at least the military. All the policy and all of the tactics and everything seems to be correct. And do you still think it's so for the complete of the war or the length of the war?
Well,
or is it just the initial? Or?
Whether American troops should have ever gone into South Vietnam is the great unknown question. You can argue both sides, you know. There were Americans at the time who did not want American troops to go into South Vietnam for those exact reasons. It was a foreign country, and it was very difficult, and the way we fought was not the way that the war should have been fought. In some ways, I think you could make a very strong argument to say that the Americans should have just stayed as advisors, should have tried to continue to build the South Vietnamese military, should have tried to give them more weapons, more aid, more ammunition, taught them how to fight. Anybody could make a very strong argument on that. At the time, though, people thought that South Vietnam was near collapse, politically and militarily.
Correctly or no? Just assumption? Or?
I think that was, I don't think they were. They were further down the road than we wanted, but not on the edge, if that makes sense, you know? Whereas Westmoreland and people thought that they were on the edge.
That's right.
You know, but there were some bad defeats out in Phuc Long province and in Quang Nhai areas. But I mean, things were still pretty good in the Delta. Things were still pretty good. But I personally think that probably we America should have had less of a footprint and more supporting the South Vietnamese. But I'm not a general, so.
Very interesting. Vietnamization. So there's a reverse in there. The American come in and it's kind of, they feel like they can't do it, or it's a time to withdraw, or
well,
for whatever reason.
There was two points to this. First off, Nixon comes in, and by that time, '69, there was a lot of unease in America about the Vietnam War. So Nixon politically had very little choice but to begin America's withdrawal. Between the casualties we were suffering and the money we were spending and sort of the black eye we were getting around the world for it. But the other thing is, the reason why we started to do that is that President Tew also wanted this policy. He wanted the Americans to leave. And he had begun in late 68, early 69, to begin saying to the Americans, we are strong now, we are stronger now. After the Tet 68 attacks, after the mini Tet attacks, the communists clearly had suffered very heavy casualties. They were retreating. They had just launched this pacification program. They had reclaimed over 1,000 villages and hamlets. President Tew, rightly, thought, we are now winning the war, okay? The South Vietnamese military had fought well in the Tet offensives. We just need for you to train us, to give us more weapons, to give us more ammunition, and you Americans can begin to withdraw.
Well, which one is true? That's the version that you gave. But another version that people gave is like 1968. You can see the embassy, the Viet Cong got in there. It's almost like all over the country, from the Hatter Sound to Kamau, which is
right. Yeah.
Virtually the whole country got attacked.
Well, I mean, the Tet Offensive was certainly a. What people forget is that the offensive, that there was an attack coming. Both the South Vietnamese and the Americans knew an attack was planned. They just didn't understand how widespread it was and how many troops were involved and how many cities were attacked. That's what shocked them. And the image of a handful of sappers getting into the embassy from a military point of view was no big deal. From a political point of view, was very devastating because it appeared to strike at the strength of the Americans, right. But the same thing happened on the South Vietnamese side. The VC got into the radio station in Saigon. They took over large parts of Cha Lon. They got into Hue, but within days they were pushed out of Saigon. It took a lot longer in Hue, but they had a lot more troops there. So from a military perspective, the North Vietnamese and the communists lost probably 30,000 troops. And it was a massive defeat for them. Mm-hmm. But politically, it seemed to show that the war was nowhere near going to end. It was just going to keep dragging on and dragging on.
Yeah, Frank Snap said that the American, like you said, knew about this attack before, like 5 days, because of one of the spies deep in there. And then, but the other thing he said is because of that, pacification, Vietnamization was done also, partly after 1968, because most of them were killed, but that wasn't in the magazine, that wasn't in the dailies, that wasn't in the news, that wasn't in anywhere.
Because I can't speak about the Tet Offensive and Frank's claim, but that VC spy was extremely highly classified, and they can't release it. But you have to understand. So the thing that I don't want people to hear or think from my speak is that the Americans knew everything. They did not. We just had a suspicion that there was an attack coming. The South Vietnamese thought the same thing. And in fact, I just saw a cable yesterday about them talking to President Tew about how long they should have a ceasefire for Tet. And they thought that there was something coming in I Corps, but they did not know the details. They did not know so unfortunately, many South Vietnamese think the Americans knew everything and did nothing. That's totally wrong. Totally wrong. The Americans reacted very quickly, and they fought very hard too.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you say the American, there's always the CIA, which is always on the mind of every Vietnamese. Everything is controlled by the CIA.
Yeah, I don't have to tell you. It's total. It's just, for an American historian, it's just, we just look at that and just smile because it's not even remotely true. I mean, the embassy had close contacts with the South Vietnamese government. The CIA had close contacts, but it was more from just to understand what the South Vietnamese government was thinking, and to also pass information on what the American government was thinking. You know, we want to announce a ceasefire during Tet, as an example. So they would speak to them, how, you know, this is what we think, what do you think? You know, it wasn't the Americans coming in and telling them what to do, because the South Vietnamese would say, well, we only, and the Americans wanted to have a three-day ceasefire, but President Thieu said, nope, only 1 day, 24 hours. And so it was 24 hours. So this idea that the CIA controls everything is completely false.
Okay. That gives a lot of clarification, at least for the Vietnamese.
Yes.
It seems to all the powerful mafia right inside the government doing all the things that we don't know.
Right.
Finally, we come to Paris Agreement. Well, in your book, you said that's the best that we can get out of that. And the Vietnamese are saying these are the death sentence that we get from the American. Well,
the Paris Agreement was, as I wrote, the best of a bad deal. I have seen a lot of writing from the North Vietnamese side, and including the instructions from the Hanoi to their negotiating team. Here are the things that we will accept. Here are the things we will not accept. And the number one thing that they would not do was withdraw their troops from South Vietnam. And the number one thing that President Thieu wanted was to withdraw and make all the North Vietnamese troops go away. And so you had two completely opposite things. And so what Kissinger and tried to do was try to split the difference, you know, to say, okay, the troops can stay, but you can't reinforce them. You can't have anything coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You can only have a one-for-one replacement. And the idea was that eventually, hopefully, that that peace would come, and that the North Vietnamese could not sustain their force in South Vietnam, and that they would turn and focus on economic development in North Vietnam and withdraw their troops, and peace would come that way. That was the hope.
That was the hope, but is that the reality?
No, because...
No, I mean, when I mean reality, I don't mean like something that people don't know, but that sincerely was the hope. But Kissinger was pragmatic enough to see, and all the Vietnamese were pragmatic to see that these very bad faith agreements.
Well, yes, it was totally bad faith on the North Vietnamese part. But at that same time, and the Americans were prepared to bomb to support them, but you have to remember that Watergate began to really impact President Nixon at that time. So his ability to militarily support the agreement vanished within months. And then Congress, the U.S. Congress, cut off aid. They cut off all military stuff. So I've talked to Kissinger, and he said, we thought we were going to I believed that we were going to have to go back and bomb to get them to, that they would try and push, you know, that we'd have to go back and bomb to tell them, no, we're not going to put up with this. But President Nixon became politically weakened by Watergate and couldn't do it.
You just mentioned Kissinger. Tell us about him. The Vietnamese are always curious about Kissinger, and they don't ever know.
Well, he's always told me, and I've talked to him multiple times, that, you know, that he respected President Thieu a great deal, that he had, that he was trying to find the best method of peace and trying to support, and you remember that he wanted to support the South Vietnamese government politically, militarily, economically, not because he was greatly in love with South Vietnam, but because... You're
talking about Nixon or Kissinger?
Kissinger, but because keeping to have a successful Paris Agreement would support American foreign policy in other places around the globe, particularly with the Russians and the Chinese, that they could create peace or lower the nuclear war threshold, because if you could see that the South Vietnamese peace agreement was working and the Americans were supporting it, that would help American foreign policy around the globe. So this idea that Kissinger and Nixon just signed the agreement and hoped that South Vietnam would die is completely false. They wanted South Vietnam to survive and prosper because not because they loved South Vietnam, but because it supported American foreign policy elsewhere. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so you do think that Kissinger is very sincere in his trying to establish peace for Vietnam, and he believes in the Paris Agreement or anything?
Well, I don't know. He was very sincere in trying to establish peace. He knew that the Paris Agreement was, that if it was followed to the letter, it would bring peace. But he did not have any, as did Nixon, did not have any naive belief that the North Vietnamese would follow it perfectly. He knew that they would try to undermine it. And that's why he told me that I expected to have to go back to bomb again and then go back to Les Docteurs and say, listen, we're going to keep bombing you guys until you actually,
So that was his actual intention, if not for the Watergate.
Correct. And Nixon's also.
So which come back to your book again. In the very beginning of the book, you were saying something about Corinthian, looking through the dark.
Oh, that's a biblical phrase. Yeah, looking through a mirror, a glass darkly. Yeah.
Yes.
That was because it was very difficult for Americans, even at senior levels, to truly understand the dynamics of what was happening in the country.
Are you trying to say there's some fatalism in there, regardless of what we do? Or
no, I don't want to say fatalism. I mean, I think most Americans who served there were trying their best to support South Vietnam. They wanted the country to succeed. They wanted the country to prosper. It just, unfortunately, didn't work.
And then your conclusion again with the Leviticus.
Yes.
Drawn swords.
That was attempt to. As I've told you, the title for Black April was a title that Vietnamese would understand and be drawn to. But Drawn Swords was a title that I did to draw Americans to take a look at South Vietnam, not as this corrupt right-wing dictatorship, but a country trying to build itself with all its struggles and all its mistakes and all the right things it's doing. So I was trying to tell Americans, time to take a new look at South Vietnam and see it for all the good things it did and all the bad things. But it's just, that's a growing country, And so that's what I tried to use that biblical phrase.
Well, the Vietnamese also have another saying. They always quote Lord Palmerston about the friends and enemies and interests. No two countries are ever enemies, and
right. There are. Well, that's an old political phrase. There are no permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests.
Exactly. Yeah. So, do you believe in that? Any of that?
That's to me to your point earlier, a very fatalistic, cynical view of things. I don't know. I guess I've never thought about that way, but I would say I probably true. But not completely true,
Yeah, I find it a curious parallel that Francis Fitzgerald was referring the find the lake with I Ching, and yours with the Bible. That's why I was trying to keep bringing up 50 years, and then with the Westerner trying to use the Eastern book
right.
to tell the American that they don't understand anything over there. And here we have you as American giving the Bible to all the readers and saying maybe the Vietnamese are going to understand who we were and what we did.
I was just trying to, trying to use something that would that would resonate with Americans and resonate hopefully with Vietnamese, that even though this was a fight in a distant land, it was still important,
When you wrote this book, it was primarily for the American, or was it primarily for the Vietnamese that we were targeting ultimately in your mind when you wrote it?
You always ask me this question. I don't. I never sort of think of the audience, which probably is a flaw of mine as a writer. I just wanted to tell the story of how, especially President Thieu, was trying to build the country and the Second Republic, and try to tell the story of the struggles of the South Vietnamese people and government to try and build their country. in the midst of a very difficult war. And so I didn't think this book is for the Vietnamese. I didn't think this book is for the Americans. I just thought I want to tell the story as best I can. Because I've met so many South Vietnamese who gave their whole life to this, you know. And I think probably in the back of my head, I thought I wanted to honor them, you know, and tell their story so that they were not lost to history, like Cao Van Tan, who built the land reform. No one, I was the only guy to ever interview him. He had been obscure for 35 years. And Phan Kim Nop, the Minister of the Economy, how he was trying to change the economy to make it more, and Nha, the same thing, you know, trying to build the country. Their stories had never been told, so I wanted to make sure it was not lost to history.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. It's always interesting to talk to you.
Thank you.
I know there's time, and get more and more interesting talking to you every time, and I hope the next time it will be better.
All right, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.